The year is 85 AD. The Roman Empire is near the apex of its power, controlling a vast area from the cold, wet Scottish highlands in the north to the searing hot Sahara Desert in the south. The Roman Emperor, Domitian, upon ascending to the imperial throne, adopts a non-expansionist, more defensive foreign policy, moving away from the aggressive conquest of his predecessors. Domitian erects a vast network of forts, roads, and watchtowers along the empire's frontiers on the Rhine River, consolidating the borders. Further east, on the Danubian frontier of the empire, a dormant but ascending threat was brewing on the other side of the border.
In the wilderness of the Carpathian Mountains, which encompass much of modern-day Romania, was home to a mysterious people of Thracian origin, known as the Dacians. Unlike other barbarian tribes known to the Romans, the Dacians had a high degree of urbanization, constructing buildings from stone, and their ruins still visible to this day. Their capital city, named Sarmițăgăuța, was built on top of a 1,200-meter-high mountain, comprising of 6 fortresses and a sacred religious complex. Sarmițăgăuța was a testament to the ingenuity and industry of the Dacians, setting them apart from other barbarian tribes, whose settlements were usually constructed from perishable materials like wood. The Dacians also had wealth in natural resources from their rich gold, silver, salt, and iron mines. This abundance of metals led to skillfully crafted works of jewelry and coinage. The ruling aristocracy were also well educated, with knowledge of science and writing from their contact with the Greco-Roman world.
By the time of Domitian's reign, the Dacian tribes were united under a single ruler, King Duras, who oversaw the expansion of Dacian power in the Balkans and the Black Sea coast. Having previously been divided into 5 kingdoms and reduced to a defensive state, this was an exciting time for the Dacians, who would have remembered their glory days under their last great king, Burebista, almost 150 years earlier. Burebista was the last king to unite the Dacian tribes, and under his leadership conquered neighboring polities such as the Celtic Boii tribe, Scythians, and Greek cities on the Black Sea coast. Inevitably, Burebista would come into conflict with Rome when he backed the Roman general Pompey against Caesar in the Roman Civil War of 49 to 44 BC. When Caesar overcame Pompey, he planned a conquest of Dacia to punish Burebista, but was never able to do so as he was assassinated by the Senate in 44 BC. Burebista met a similar fate as he was assassinated in a civil uprising around the same time.
Fast forward to Durras's reign, and now, united as a single nation, the Dacians were ready to carry out what Burebista was unable to do, and challenge the Romans head-on.
In 85 AD, King Duras, now in old age, voluntarily abdicates in favor of a younger, more energetic man. His name was Decebalus, and upon ascending to the Dacian throne, Decebalus, along with his senior general Susagus, quickly assembled an army to raid into the Roman province of Moesia. The unsuspecting Roman garrison was overwhelmed, with Tacitus later saying, one after the other, experienced officers were defeated in fortified positions. The governor of Moesia, Oppius Sabinus, would march the 5th Macedonica Legion to confront the invaders, but was defeated and killed in the ensuing battle, with the remnants of the 5th Macedonica Legion fleeing back, bloody and beaten. Additional legions from neighboring Dalmatia province would later rush in to help, but the damage was done. Decebalus and his troops left behind ravaged cities, towns, and farms, withdrawing back safely across the Danube, with loot and prisoners in hand. Hearing of the chaos in the Balkans, Domitian gathered several legions, cohorts of the Praetorian Guard, and auxiliary troops to march to Moesia to launch a counteroffensive. Notably, Domitian did not lead the army himself across the Danube, but waited in a fortified city on the frontier while sending the Praetorian prefect, Cornelius Fuscus, to lead the army in Dacia. Fuscus successfully drove the Dacians back across the border in mid-85, prompting Domitian to return to Rome and celebrate an elaborate triumph. Fuscus looked to capitalize on this victory, and in the year 86 AD, launched an expedition across the Danube and into Dacian territory. As Fuscus's men marched into Dacia, they reached a mountain pass where Decebalus and his army laid an ambush. Fuscus tried to rally his men amid the panic, but was killed in the ensuing battle. One of his legions, the 5th Aulade, was annihilated, and the battle standard of the Praetorian Guard was lost. The Praetorian cohorts would be restored, but the 5th Aulade was never reformed. The 5th Aulade was commanded by Marcus Liberius Maximus, who was killed with the rest of his legion. Liberius' personal slave, Calidromus, was taken prisoner by the Dacian general Susagus, and was sent as a gift to the Parthian king Pacorus. Amazingly, 30 years later, Calidromus would escape captivity and return to his home in Bithynia Pontus. The remnants of Fuscus' army flooded back across the Danube to bring news of the crushing defeat in Dacia. Horror stories began circulating of curved Dacian swords slicing through Roman helmets and hacking off limbs with a single blow. These were not disorganized hordes of Gaulish Celts that they were dealing with, but a well-organized and well-trained army with formidable leadership at the top. However, the Romans would soon be back with more armies, the latest counteroffensive being led by Tetius Julianus, a former consul who commanded the 7th Claudia Legion. In 88 AD, just 2 years after Fuscus' defeat, Julianus' army crossed the Danube and pushed over the Carpathian Mountains into central Dacia. It was at a place called Tepe, just west of the Dacian capital of Sarmizegeutsa, that the Romans encountered the Dacian army led by the leading general Vezinus, who according to Cassius Dio was ranked next after King Decebalus. In Dacian society, the most high-ranking individual after the king was the high priest. Therefore, Vezinus may well have been the high priest of the time. Julianus and his troops were well aware that the Dacians had wiped out an entire legion only 2 years before, so to incentivize his men, he ordered all of his legionaries to paint their name and the name of their centurion onto their shield. This would make the most valiant fighters readily identifiable for later rewards. This would have the desired effect of motivating Julianus' troops, and they delivered on the battlefield by routing the Dacians at Tepe and slaying a great number of them. Vezinus, the Dacian commander, narrowly avoided death by throwing himself amongst the dead corpses and pretended to be dead. Once nighttime fell, he got up and escaped back to the capital. The news of the defeat reached Decebalus, who ordered wooden barricades be built across the valley leading to Sarmizegeutsa, while also nailing armor to tree trunks to give the impression that the barricades were manned. With winter soon approaching, Julianus decided to set up camp at Tepe and advance on the capital in the following spring. However, Julianus' plans will be interrupted by events transpiring far away on the Rhine River. By 89 AD, Domitian had been emperor for 8 years, and in that time, his approval ratings were mixed among the different factions in society. The general public were perfectly fine with Domitian, as he undertook the rebuilding of Rome after it was devastated by fires some 30 years earlier. The Praetorian Guard favored Domitian heavily, and were the ones who initially declared him Caesar after the death of his brother Titus. The Senate, however, hated Domitian, as he refused to give them the level of power they previously had. He viewed himself as an absolute ruler, and this was a direct affront to the republican spirit that still existed in Rome, albeit much less important as it was during the time of the Roman Republic. As a result, Domitian had a lot of powerful enemies, and one in particular would eventually rise up against him in revolt. That man was Lucius Antonius Saturninus, governor of Upper Germania. Although his exact motivations are not known, there was contention with Domitian's policy of maintaining the Roman frontiers instead of expanding into Germania, and having previously been a senator, Saturninus likely bore animosity towards the emperor. It would be the late winter of 89 AD when Saturninus put his revolt into motion. He assembled 4 legions stationed on the Rhine frontier, the 14th Gemina and the 21st Rapax legions based out of Mogontiacum, what is now Mainz today, plus the 8th Augusta and the 11th Claudia legions garrisoned at Argentoratum, the predecessor of modern-day Strasbourg. To supplement his legions, Saturninus also planned on paying German tribes from the east of the Rhine to take part in the revolt, using funds from the savings banks of his own legions. These treasuries were administered by the legion's standard bearers and contained the legion's salaries imperial subsidies, and proceeds from the sale of spoils. The revolt was scheduled to take place in late winter, with the Germans crossing the frozen Rhine River and joining his legions. However, upon hearing of Saturninus and his treachery, the governor of Lower Germania, Lucius Maximus, marched his legions up the Rhine River to confront him. What happened next was recorded by the Roman biographer Suetonius, who was 20 years old at the time of the revolt. Only an amazing stroke of luck checked the rebellion. The Rhine thawed at the very hour of battle, preventing Saturninus' German allies from crossing the ice to join him. In light of this turn of events, the troops who remained loyal disarmed the rebels. As for Saturninus, Lucius Maximus overcame him and destroyed him. It is said the heads of Saturninus and members of his inner circle were sent back to Rome and displayed in the Forum, on Domitian's orders. Cassius Dio, writing about the event some 100 years later, would say that it would be impossible to say how many he killed, referring to the retribution Domitian carried out, even going so far as to prohibit the entering of the victims' names in official records. The rebellion was defeated primarily because there was no crisis of power in the Roman Empire. Domitian's position as emperor was indisputable, and his popularity with the army was stable. This made the rebellion local in nature, and it found no support in the armies of the neighboring provinces, which allowed it to be quickly suppressed by Lucius Maximus. Domitian would gain more support from the army when he increased the annual salary of all of the legionaries from 900 sesterces to 1200 sesterces. He also decreed that there would be a maximum of only 1,000 sesterces in the legion's banks, to limit the temptation of using these funds to start future rebellions. Lastly, Domitian ordered that no longer could 2 or more legions share the same base, to limit the chance of conspiracies against him. North of the Danube River, news of the revolt reached Sarmatian tribesmen, who saw it as an opportunity to attack the Romans while they were still distracted. With the Danube River still frozen, the Sarmatians began launching raids into Moesia, once again savaging towns and farms, who only recently recovered from the Dacian raids a few years before. Meanwhile at Tepe, in Dacia, Julianus was preparing to march his Roman legions against the Dacian capital of Sarmizegeutsa when he received word of the legions revolting on the Upper Rhine. He also learned that the Sarmatians were raiding all over Moesia to his rear. Fearing that he would be encircled by the Dacians and the Sarmatians, Julianus withdrew across the Danube and re-entered Moesia. By this time, Domitian had come up from Rome to once again personally lead an army and deal with the barbarian raiders. As he linked up with Julianus in Moesia, the Sarmatians withdrew across the Danube and avoided a direct confrontation. Decebalus and the Dacians then offered Domitian a peace treaty, but only if the Romans paid him a hefty tribute. Domitian not only turned this proposal down, but he executed the Dacian envoys who brought the peace offer. Now facing the prospect of losing face and needing some kind of victory, Domitian sent his army marching into the neighboring province of Pannonia in modern-day Hungary. Tribes of Marcomanni Germans, who lived beyond the Pannonian frontier, had earlier refused to help Domitian against the Dacians when he asked them to. Domitian was intent on punishing them for remaining neutral in the conflict. Hearing that the Romans were coming after them, the Germans preemptively attacked and repulsed Domitian's army on the Roman side of the Danube River, hamstringing Domitian's retribution plan. With his troops in Pannonia retreating, Domitian knew peace was his only option and agreed to a treaty with the Dacians. In this deal, Domitian agreed to pay large annual sums of gold to the Dacians, as well as provide Decebalus with engineering and military advisors. Apart from the Dacians withdrawing from the Moesian frontier, all the Romans got in return were a few Roman prisoners out of the many that were held captive by the Dacians. This lopsided peace deal didn't stop Domitian from celebrating a triumph when he returned to Rome, with Cassius Dio calling it a performance that filled him with conceit, as if he had achieved some great success. Following the signing of the peace treaty, Domitian divided the province of Moesia into 2, with Upper Moesia to the west and Lower Moesia to the east. This was to ensure that the defense of the region would not rest on the shoulders of one incapable governor who was unequal to the task, as had been the case with Oppius Sabinus. As a result of Domitian's capitulation, Rome's prestige and perception of invincibility had been tarnished. Tacitus, who himself commanded a legion at this time, blasted the incompetence that had cost Rome her pride, saying that it was no longer the frontier and the Danube line that was threatened, but the permanent quarters of the legions and the security of the empire. 4 legions would be stationed in the provinces of Moesia, with an additional 4 in neighboring Pannonia province. They stood watch on the Danube, tensed for another attack from across the river by the Dacians or their allies. Over the next decade, there would be an uneasy peace along the frontier, but it was not to last.